Great. So, folks, it's lovely to have you join us today. We are delighted to be able to share this information session with you online. So I'm Annmarie O'Kane. I work with the Centre for Cross-Border Cooperation. We're based in Armagh, just on the border. And if you know the centre, it is a small, independent think tank, think and do tank. So we're analysing lots of cross-border issues, and we're also fostering collaboration and coming up with initiatives to generate some cross-border action. So I suppose just to kick this morning off now, just to let you know that I'm joined by Una Boyd from the CAJ. So she's our specialist in all things immigration from the UK end of things. And then we also have, hopefully on the call, we have Inez from the Northwest Migrants Forum. But look, I suppose what we're going to do now this morning, just to give you a quick idea of what's going to happen. The centre has been doing lots of work in cross-border areas for a long time. The project I work on, Border People, has been fostering collaboration and cooperation in order to provide information to people for many, many years. But in that time, we've gathered up a lot of information. We've gathered up an awful lot of contacts, and there's other people in this arena too. As we have Rose Tierney on the call as well, who's a dual qualified tax expert. So you might already know Rose. Now, we were really lucky last year to be able to take part in a commissioned report by the Labour and Economic. Let me see if I'm going to just share the right screen with you. This is the report that we took part in last year. So it's a study in the current conditions of the island of Ireland labour market. And it really was an in-depth assessment into what it means to live, to work, to employ people across the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. So you can see the authors there that I shared lots of time with on this report: Maureen O'Reilly, Rose Tierney, the tax consultant that I mentioned a moment ago, and Anne Devlin from the ESRI. So this report kind of captures lots of the work that we've been doing over the years. It was commissioned by LEAF, so that's the Labour, Employment and Economic Forum, and it was also part of the Shared Island Working Group. So lots of contact there with government sources, which was really useful while we were preparing the report. So it really does delve deep into the conditions on the island of Ireland at the moment, its labour market, and it really does look at what does it mean to live and work here and to employ people. So first of all, I suppose before we go into the topic that we've chosen for today, we have to consider the mobility links in between the jurisdictions. We know that there are many people travelling across the border on a daily basis. We know the roads are full, the trains are full, and if you're lucky enough to be in a part of the island that has a train or on a motorway, you can see that you're travelling at commuter times along with an awful lot of other individuals. So we think that there's 25,000 people working and studying across the border. Now, they're from official statistics. 18,000 people, it's also frequently mentioned that they cross the border to go to work every day. And the data is there for those 18,000, but we think perhaps it's an underestimate, quite an underestimate. So we think that there are many, many more people doing that. And we also know from the stats that there's at least 80% of cross-border workers on this island live and work in the border region, which isn't too surprising. Of course, with remote working, people are travelling further and further now for work because they don't mind. They're only doing it maybe 1 or 2 days a week. So that's why we're calling it cross-border workers and all island workers, because people are travelling quite a distance now. So within the report, to give you an idea of the factors that we considered, and we're not going to go into all of these today, we're just going to focus on one. So the report looked at personal taxation, pensions, and entitlements and portability. That's really complicated, both of those chapters. Social welfare systems, qualifications and skills, and how do they work on an all-island basis. The cross-border mobility of workers, so the free movement and the legal routes to mobility, which is why we are on the call today. The changing world of work, there was a really thorough chapter on it, which brings lots of the complications together into one chapter, and that really does focus an awful lot on remote working and how that changed quite a lot of the working day for people here. And then the report also looks at collective bargaining and trade union coverage. And we're thinking again, all of this on an all-island context. So there were many challenges and many there were opportunities and challenges throughout each of the chapters, but one of the overarching challenges that kept coming across the table was the fact that there was an information failure. Anything to do with cross-border is going to be complicated. With the right information, it doesn't have to be as complicated. With the right information, we can prevent people from things becoming so complicated that it actually puts them off taking up an opportunity across the border or hiring somebody from across the border. So information is absolutely key to all of this. Information to be able to handle the challenges and the obstacles that we have now in place, but we also have to keep our eye on how to actually reduce some of the challenges and some of the obstacles. So we have our eye on that within the centre. One of the overarching challenges as well throughout all of the chapters is the fact that things are diverging between the jurisdictions, north, south and east, west because of Brexit. So that's an area of concern and something quite a challenge, I think, for everyone to keep on top of that one. So just to pull those out. So across all of the chapters, they were two of the most overarching challenges across the chapters. So today we're going to look at the mobility of workers then. So, and we do mention it in the report that the mobility of people can be restricted by any of the challenges that are set out in the report. A tax complication could put them off going across the border. That is certainly an obstacle. And there are many other obstacles, like whether or not their skills and their qualifications are going to be recognised across the border. That's definitely an obstacle. But we decided to focus in that chapter on the legal movement of workers. And that was really prompted, of course, because of Brexit. So we know that before Brexit, we had and even before our EU membership, there were common protections for Irish and British individuals to live and to work and to study in each other's jurisdictions. So that free flow, that legal route for Irish and British was there before EU membership. So we know that, and we've heard lots about it in recent years. So beyond work and study, it also provides access to healthcare, to social security, to education and certain voting rights. And lots of those rights and entitlements became embedded actually and deliverable through some of the EU regulations then that occurred whenever that were relevant to here whenever Ireland and the UK joined the EU in the 1970s. So a lot of that was underpinned, and so that kind of shook us a little bit whenever we could see Brexit coming, and we really did focus in on what exactly the Common Travel Area provided for here. So with Brexit now, we know that things have changed for non-Irish EU citizens. Their free movement on the island is very different now. But just to say, I suppose at the outset, that there are certain routes and still certain EU rights and entitlements here, and I'll talk about those in just a moment. And then Una's going to help me with some of the really complicated bits that arise out of the visa requirements because of the new UK rules and regulations. So just jumping very, very quickly into the EU right to employment then. So it hasn't completely vanished from the island. There were people who lived here from other places and worked here from other places before the end of the transition period. So anyone who was living and resident in the UK by December 2020, this is the really crucial date, they're entitled to apply and have hopefully already applied to the EU settlement scheme. So that protects their rights. All of their EU rights that they had before Brexit still exist for them, provided they have applied successfully to that scheme. They can live and work and access services in Northern Ireland. So that's good. So that's your EU and EEA citizens. Now, for others, they weren't resident here, but they were working here. So we think of EU and EEA citizens who are living in the south, so not necessarily Irish. Irish, we can park that for a little moment. So people from other places who were living in the south, working in the north, they were able to protect their existing EU right to free movement and to take up employment in Northern Ireland through the UK's Frontier Worker Permit scheme. Now, that scheme is only open to people who were employed by that 30th of December 2020. That is the absolutely crucial date for them. And anything to do with the withdrawal agreement, you know, that's the date that we're looking for whenever we speak to a person or speak to an employer. When did you hire them? So what that tells us is that, or what it means for them is that their family members are, no, it doesn't. It prevents them from having to go through the visa route. That's the main for both of these schemes. For the EU settlement scheme, they will not need a visa to live in the UK, in Northern Ireland or any part of the UK. And for the Frontier Worker Permit scheme, they will not need a visa to work in Northern Ireland. So they avoid an awful lot of paperwork by being part of those two schemes, and it holds on to their EU rights for them. Now you can see there's one of the bullet points that Irish do not need to apply, but they can if they wish. And you would certainly recommend that you would try to hold on to as many of your EU rights as you can, and that through that Frontier Permit scheme, you can hold on to your entitlements within the EU. Now, there is a caveat there. British citizens cannot apply. So somebody who's been born in Northern Ireland and automatically deemed to be British, who is now living in the south, and maybe working in the north, they're a dual British Irish citizen, perhaps, and that dual citizenship and the British citizenships means that they cannot apply for the Frontier Worker Permit scheme. Also, it doesn't go just as far as the settlement scheme. It doesn't include any entitlement for family members. They're out of this. So it will not permit them to enter the UK, which is mostly what this permit does. It is your legal point of entry into the UK. Now, the permit costs nothing at all. It is valid for 5 years. 2 for some individuals if they've only got retained worker status, but for the majority of people, it will be 5 years. It'll remain valid for. So hopefully it'll remain at a zero cost to them as well. Now there is another scheme. There's no deadline to apply for this, but because it includes your right to enter Northern Ireland, you'd imagine that most people should have it by now, unless they've been remote working for all of that time. So we can't find very much information about it. We also can't find much information about the numbers of individuals who are crossing the border here who have a permit. There is UK-wide information, and there are people maybe on the call who've got more up-to-date information than I have, but the latest information that we've had and consistent information over the years since the scheme came out, there is no regional information. For the EU settlement scheme, yes, you can get regional information broken down. So we know how many people in Northern Ireland are living under that scheme, but we don't know how many workers have a permit. And this is a little bit of a worry for us and those in the advice sectors, because we're not getting an awful lot of questions about the scheme. So we would worry that perhaps some people are becoming undocumented and maybe are now in a vulnerable situation when they enter the UK to work. So these are yeah, this is certainly a worry to us. Now, let's just see. I'm getting into visa territory now, so I'm getting a little bit shaky, and that's why I'm so happy that Una is on the call with us. So just to talk about, I suppose, who doesn't need a visa, first of all. So Irish and British don't need a visa to work in each other's jurisdiction. We're covered under the Common Travel Area. So the settlement scheme holders don't need a UK visa. The Frontier Worker Permit holders don't need a UK visa to work in Northern Ireland, and citizens with UK indefinite leave to remain. So they do not need a visa. So that's good news for those individuals. But I'm now going to quickly pass over to Una, who knows much, much more about this. This is really complicated stuff.
Thank you, Annmarie. Yeah, and I feel like I'm starting this with the caveat that we could do, 6 webinars on UK visas alone and then do another 6 on Irish visas. So we are just going to try and do a very broad overview today, but if anyone has specific questions or anything comes up during this, I'm happy to follow up and signpost people to further information. So I should introduce myself. Sorry, my name's Una. I'm a solicitor at CAJ, an independent human rights organisation based in Belfast, and we do a lot of work on essentially the impact of UK immigration law and policy on Northern Ireland, and particularly on the unique and often overlooked impacts on cross-border life. So we've worked a lot with Annmarie and everyone else on these issues. So thank you very much for asking me to join today. Based on what Annmarie has just said, something that I think is important to emphasise is that after Brexit, the provisions that were provided under the EU settlement scheme and under the Frontier Workers scheme, they're really a bit of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity in terms of UK immigration, because they are free applications, and they provide really broad, secure range of rights in the UK. If you get status under the EU settlement scheme, it not only is it free, but it's then very straightforward for that to become permanent, in which case you are then settled in the UK. Frontier Workers Scheme, similar way, it offers really broad protection and rights, basically on the same basis as British citizens. That is really unique and really rare. That is not normally how the Home Office looks at visas. So if you come across someone, or if you think that you might be eligible for either of those, I would really encourage you to get advice as quickly as you can. Although we are quite far past the sort of the times when the schemes were launched, with the Frontier Worker Scheme, there is no deadline to apply. And with the EU settlement scheme, there is still an opportunity to make a late application, but it is a bit more complex. And there's lots of great advice services in Northern Ireland who are specialising in that. So if anyone's wants more information on that, I'd be happy to provide it. So yeah, in terms of what I'm going to talk about, something that I want to emphasize is like we use the phrase visa and non-visa national quite frequently. So I wanted to start there in terms of saying what does that actually mean? So a visa national is simply someone who has to have a visa to enter the UK, even as a visitor, even to enter for a day, they're going to have a visa in advance of entering the UK, and that includes traveling over the land border. A non-visa national is someone who is allowed to visit the UK without applying in advance for a visa. They're only allowed to enter for 6 months as a visitor without a visa, but it's still quite different because they, for example, could cross the border for one day without having to get a visa in advance. So it comes up a lot when we talk about cross-border mobility, and I wanted to sort of start there. Um, and also just to emphasize that when we talk about cross-border mobility on the island of Ireland, Northern Ireland is UK immigration law, the South is Irish immigration law, and never the twain shall meet. There is often an assumption that living and working and having a visa in one or the other jurisdiction gives you some rights or gives some kind of reciprocal arrangement, between the two. That isn't the case. When we think of immigration law here, we really have to think of the border as this big red line. And it's it's a huge issue for people, and there's a lot of misinformation about it. We don't have any reciprocal visa between the north and south, except for two, and they're both very limited, designed for tourism. So, for example, there's a British and Irish visa scheme, but it's only for Chinese and Indian tourists. There's none designed for employment or business for people living on the island of Ireland. And we have that open land border. We have no checks, and that's where a lot of misunderstanding happens, because people think, well, like, I'm allowed to travel, I haven't been checked, so I have a visa that's issued by Ireland, so I must be allowed to visit Northern Ireland. That's not the case. The immigration rules, like I said, we need to think of it as a big red line, apply differently at each side of the border, and you have to have the right visa when you cross it. And it's really important that particularly employers, but that everyone understands this, because the impact of somebody just popping over the border can be absolutely life-threatening if they are encountered by immigration control and found to have essentially entered one of the jurisdictions unlawfully. And I think particularly we've seen lots of ramp up of the Garda checks on the border. I'm sure everyone's seen that in the news. So it's really important that people understand this. And essentially, if in doubt, don't assume you can just pop over the border. I think the next slide, Annmarie, is starting us on sort of, yeah, UK visas. And here, this is sort of just an example of the amount of visas that are being granted by the UK. But for anyone who wants to work in Northern Ireland, what we are looking at is the UK immigration visa system. And that applies to pretty much everyone who isn't British or Irish who wants to come to the UK to work. It, of course, now, as Annmarie said, includes EU nationals since Brexit, except EU nationals who were living before that crucial date of December 2020, who were able to get rights under the EU settlement scheme or Frontier Workers Scheme. If you're an EU national and this is your first time going to the UK to live and work, you're going to just come under the same visa system as everyone else now. The work visa system in the UK is known as the points-based system, and it's pretty complex, to say the least. And it becomes even more complex when we look at sort of cross-border issues, like, for example, if somebody wants to live in the south and commute to work in the north, as far as I'm aware, there's no visa designed for that. You have to actually move to the UK in order to be able to apply for the visa. I am still looking into that one, Annmarie, but it's an example of it's also not really designed to take the land border into account. This is London-centric UK immigration at its best. So if you want to come to Northern Ireland to work, you're going to need to apply for a UK visa. You're going to have to jump through a lot of hoops. And I think the next slide, Annmarie, has highlighted one of the most common visas that people apply for, which is the skilled worker visa. I think it is the most common, I think potentially it was in, sorry, the previous data, but it's the most common visa that is used for people to be able to move to the UK to work. It requires you to have a UK sponsor, so a UK employer who has a sponsorship license, who is essentially that you're coming to work for. You have to meet a points-based requirement, which is essentially done by adding up lots of different things and how much you meet the eligibility requirements. So you get points based on English language skills, you get points based on your salary. And currently the salary threshold for this is that the person would need to be earning £38,700 a year. Now, that's really quite high. I'm sure everyone has had the same reaction to that, that's the minimum salary to be eligible for this visa. This was bumped up just last year, I think just last year, yeah, by the UK government from, I think it was 26,000, so a really significant change. It came in for a lot of criticism, particularly for people living in areas like rural areas in England, like Northern Ireland, where salaries are lower. So it is very difficult to meet that salary threshold. There are some roles, some jobs that will allow you to have a lower salary, and they're included in something called the salary threshold list. So sometimes for a specific role, you'll be able to meet the eligibility requirements on a lower salary. But as I say, it does get quite tricky. So an example of that would be health and social care roles. Often they'll allow them to apply for a skilled worker visa with a lower salary threshold. Um, but this is also limited to, as the title says, skilled work. You very much have to be, I think the kind of generalized thing is that it would be work that requires education at A level and above. That's very broad, but it's kind of an example of how they view it. So it's not one that can be easily used for a lot of different types of work. It's quite strict. And when people get this, they can bring their dependents to the UK with them, so say like their spouse or their children. However, it's worth noting that the UK government, when they bumped up the fee for this one, they also in other work visas removed that right, which is really problematic, of course, for people moving to the UK to be told you can get a work visa, but you're not allowed to bring your family with you. Skilled work visa, oops, excuse me, that's my front door. A skilled work visa lasts 5 years, and it costs £1,420 to apply for. You have to pay £1,035 a year to an immigration health surcharge for the length of the visa. So, for example, if the visa is 5 years, you're talking about £5,000 for the immigration health surcharge. Family independence, if they want to come with you, their applications are separate and they will incur similar fees. So I think this visa is a really good example of essentially just the hoops people have to jump through to be able to work in Northern Ireland. And once you get this visa, so say you come here on the UK skilled worker visa, if you're a visa national and you need a visa to visit the Republic of Ireland, you're not going to be able to even visit Donegal without applying for a tourist visa. So that's again a really good example of someone and what they've gone through to live and work in Northern Ireland, but then the limitations on them because of those differences between North and South. Um, I'm briefly going to mention, I don't think we have a slide for this, but because it is so complex, but I know that a lot of businesses and a lot of employers here often like to rely on activities and work that is allowed to be done under UK visitor visas. So there is very limited activities that people can do under a visit visa. And those would be unpaid activities like attending an event or undertaking training or speaking at a conference as long as you're not paid. There's also a very limited number of things called permitted paid engagements, which are allowed under a visitor visa. And but they are extremely limited. You have to be invited by a UK organization. You need to be an expert in your field, so to be able to meet a permitted paid engagement eligibility is quite rare. So I have had some, it raised me a lot where people say, well, it's okay, they can go on a visitor visa because they're only working for one day or they're only doing this one thing, but it's not it's not a catch-all and it's not something that can be relied on. You have to be really, really careful, and you can check the UK visa website to see what is listed under the visit visa, what are people allowed to do, and particularly for permitted paid engagements, what are they allowed to do. There's also lots of other complications with this because, for example, you need, because you're crossing the land border and you don't get stamped in and out, in future people might need to show when they've entered and left to be able to rely on this right under visitor visas. It's just not the safe and easy route that some people seem to think it is. So I just wanted to flag that, and it's just not a sufficient system to support the majority of cross border work. Um, Annmarie had mentioned this, I'm sorry, in a previous slide, but something that I really, really recommend is the UK government has actually a very helpful visa checking system on their website, and I'll pop it in the chat when I'm finished speaking. It says, do I need a visa? You type in your nationality, you type in what you're planning to do, and it gives you really good, really accessible information. And I would really recommend exactly what I said earlier before anyone pops over the border, check that if you are in any doubt about your rights. Um, so the next slide looks at sponsorship licenses. I mentioned that with a skilled worker visa, you need to be sponsored by a UK employer. So if you are the employer and you're looking to bring people to the UK, I should say sorry because language is important. When I say UK here, it is interchangeable, and of course that includes Northern Ireland. So if you're an employer that wants to set up in Northern Ireland and have people coming from outside Northern Ireland to work there, that this applies. Um, you are going to need to become a licensed sponsor through the Home Office scheme. And this slide really accurately demonstrates just how complex becoming a sponsor is. You know, this is a formal Home Office process, and it brings quite significant, not only is it time consuming and complicated, you're going to need legal advice to be able to do this. It also has ongoing obligations then in how you sort of meet your obligations as a sponsor, and you have to keep reporting to the Home Office. It is not a straightforward thing to do, and generally what we find is unless it's a large company or a large organization that knows they're going to be frequently hiring people from outside the UK, this isn't, again, particularly accessible route particularly for anyone who is looking at cross-border work or bringing people just up from the south to Northern Ireland. And the key thing is, I guess, through all of this again, is just if you think that you need to look into doing this, there's really excellent immigration solicitors in Northern Ireland who specialise in this, and I'd be happy to refer you so you can get some detailed advice. Um, the next slide is our favourite electronic travel authorisation. Me and Annmarie have spent a lot of time on electronic travel authorization, but I know that this causes a lot of confusion, and especially in how it intersects with work visas. So I'm sure most people know, but electronic travel authorization is not a visa. It's a pre-clearance system for the UK, and it's designed for non-visa nationals. So like I said previously, this is people who didn't have to get a visit visa to enter the UK. They know they still don't have to get a visit visa, but they do now need to get electronic travel authorization before they travel to the UK. So it's a pre-clearance system for non-visa nationals. This does not apply to anyone who's a visa national. If you had to get a visit visa for the UK, electronic travel authorization is not relevant to you. So you just still need to get the right visa and don't need to worry about this. But it's hugely relevant because lots of people who take part in sort of cross-border work are non-visa nationals. So for example, EU citizens or non-visa nationals, they're going to have to get electronic travel authorization when they travel into Northern Ireland potentially. So it's just really important there to, I think a lot of people, for example, will have done similar when they go to America, where you get an ESTA, and it's not a visa, it is pre-clearance system. But it's important to emphasize that at the start, because having ETA doesn't grant you any right to work or live in the UK. It's not the same as having a visa. It just is that pre-clearance that allows you to enter. So what's particularly relevant is how this, we've looked a lot at how this works at the border, and I think that is something that caused a lot of confusion. Initially, this was going to apply blanket to everyone, which obviously would have been really unworkable for border communities, the idea of having to do this every time you cross the border. But At the moment, electronic travel authorization applies to non-visa nationals who are not legally resident in the Republic of Ireland. And I'll talk a little bit more about that idea of legally resident. So if you need to get EDA, you apply online. It's £10. It is going up. It probably will keep going up, although they kept telling us it would be light touch. But anyway, and once you have it, it's valid for an extended period. You can use it multiple times. And from the 2nd of April, this will apply to essentially all non-visa nationals. So if you're not British and Irish and you don't need a visit visa, you're going almost certainly need electronic travel authorization. Again, the UK government website is actually very accessible and very clear. If you want to go on, there's a little button that says, do I need an EDA? And you can check. So the exemption for legal residents in the Republic of Ireland, which is, I suppose, really important for anyone looking at cross-border work and mobility to understand, is essentially that, as it says in the tin, if you're legally resident in the Republic of Ireland, you don't and you're a non-visa national, you don't have to apply for electronic travel authorization as long as you're traveling within the common travel area. So if you have an EU citizen who is living legally in the Republic of Ireland, working, and they want to go up for, say, a one-day conference, they're not being paid, they're a non-visa national, and that's a permitted activity. So they would be able to travel up to Northern Ireland and they don't have to get electronic travel authorization. However, if you have the exact same scenario, but the person has flown in to Ireland for the first day, they're coming to your organisation, say for a week, and then you're sending them up to Belfast for one day, they are going to have to hold electronic travel authorization because they are not legally resident in the Republic of Ireland. I hope this does tend to get quite tricky, so I hope I've kind of summarized that, but again, I'm happy to go into it further. And it is, I think, key to remember that EDA doesn't change the situation for visa nationals. Some people heard the announcement, that there was an exemption now that meant people could travel into Northern Ireland without EDA as long as they had legal residence in the Republic of Ireland. And people said, "Oh, that's fantastic! Now I don't need to get a visa to work in Northern Ireland." That's not what it does. If you needed a visa to visit Northern Ireland, you still need it, and pretty much everyone, sorry, apart from British and Irish citizens, will still need a visa if they're moving to Northern Ireland to work. Also, if someone is moving to Northern Ireland to work and has their visa in place, EDA won't be relevant because again, it's if you have a visa, you don't need it. I hope that. Sorry, I feel like I made it more complicated, but I'll hand back to you now for now, Annmarie. Maybe you can, if I've made that unclear, point out, and I'll
No, no,
go into
very,
more
very
detail.
clear, very clear. And I think this slide answers the question for a lot of people that has come to us. What happens to lots of the organisations that we would collaborate with and have meetings across the border, regular meetings across the border, in fact. So this is a really popular question for us. So those who are resident in the South meet all the criteria for that residence and they're attending conferences and whatever, they don't have to worry about it. So this is good news story. This is a good news story. This one not so much, but this one yes. And I'm just wondering, I'm just thinking there, Una, the EU workers who are flying into Dublin, they will need to fly in with their passport, not just an ID card, isn't that right?
Yes,
In order to, yeah.
yeah, there's the UK has changed rules about accepting EU ID cards. Again, this is a tricky one because you shouldn't be stopped at the border. It's an open border, but you want to make sure you have the right ID in case you do encounter immigration enforcement. So we would say right now that the best advice is to tell any EU citizens if they're traveling over the land border to hold to hold an EU passport. And also for people who are resident, the UK government has outlined documents they can carry in case they encounter immigration enforcement who say, well, you should have had electronic travel authorization. It's a pretty long list of different types of ID you can have to show your residence in Ireland. And again, it's on the website there, and it's pretty accessible and
Yeah.
easy to understand.
Yeah, that's super. This is a topic we could talk for a long time on. So, Una, thanks so much for that. That was brilliant. It's complicated stuff, and I'm really glad you're on the call with me. Now, we will maybe be able to do this call again at a later point with an Irish immigration specialist. But I'll just give you a little bit of information that we found for the report, for the LEAF report. So again, you know, it mentions, and the Irish government websites mention that all non-EEA nationals require a valid employment permit or permission to work in the state. I've included a few stats there just to show you the flow of individuals. The stats beforehand, there's not much point in looking too far back because of course COVID has impacted the stats there. So we just just only went back to 2022. And then the Irish system is an online system at the moment. So that will take you through the whole process. It is a complicated system though. So some individuals have mentioned us and have mentioned to colleagues in the advice sector that it is complicated and really you would need support in order to get it right, because of course the consequences of getting it wrong are significant. So to give you an idea, so much like the UK, there is a need for an eligible job offer to be in place. There is a range of permits then, and they're available on the Department for Justice and the Department for Enterprise, Trade and Employment websites. If we look at just one of the particular permits, the critical skills, so I thought that was a little bit like the skilled worker in the UK. So it costs approximately £1,000 and it's valid for 2 years. Now, it's time and that is really one of the key things that's mentioned by businesses to us. This takes so much time. So they have their eye on the perfect candidate and they need to get a visa for them. So the applications, and this is information on the government website, should be made at least 12 weeks prior to the employment starting. So you find your candidate, which takes time, then you apply for a visa for that person, which takes at least 12 weeks. And then once they have that visa in place or the work permit in place, then they have to go and get a visa then, which can take a further 8 weeks in order for them to come and live in Ireland to work there. So, you know, this is a long process and it's something that was mentioned to us quite a lot during business engagement for the LEAF Shared Island report. So, and businesses stressed really that they are finding it difficult. There are high rates of employment. There's not many people out there to choose from. There's difficulties hiring workers and accessing skills. So they have to be able to encourage and be competitive in that to encourage people from other places to come here. So they mentioned us the cost and the time and really the impact on their competitiveness. The travel restrictions, as you mentioned, they're in a, you know, for individuals being very unsure whether or not they can travel across the border into Northern Ireland or into the south as well for their training, for their conferences, you know, for those type of events. And people are very, very worried and some individuals choose not to. So we're looking now at lost opportunity really, which is it's such a pity. So really, I suppose what came across through the limitations that came across in the business engagement was that it impacted business expansion, that there were the best set of skills were stuck on one side of the border. You know, they couldn't transfer them maybe to a plant just across the border. They couldn't include them, perhaps, those individuals, highly skilled on one side in one plant. They couldn't take them across to a site across the border that they were hoping to expand on, include them in tenders, for example. So there was best use of skills came across very clearly. And then, as I've kind of said there, the transfer of skills and knowledge, it is really curtailed and kept within one jurisdiction. That all island expertise is kind of lost. You know, it's very, very restricted because of the visas. And these are all business concerns. They're not coming from me. These are the messages that came in from business to us. And then some of the workers mentioned then, and some of the employers mentioned that they were thinking of the career path, enticing a person over onto the island and hoping to keep them here, you know, letting them settle here and encouraging them that there's a proper career path for you. But the next best job is in just across the border, so that limits those opportunities for careers as well. So just a couple of quotes I lifted from the report then, from one Irish business. So a business who's set up in the Republic. We send some workers to sites in Europe to install our products. We have to get them work permits for workers who don't have Irish passports, which is so slow. So this is an Irish business hiring Northern workers. It is so slow. It is difficult, it is costly, that we are now reluctant to hire somebody without an Irish or an EU passport, which is not all workers from Northern Ireland have that. So that's quite a stark statement from an Irish business. This is from an Irish Institute of Technology. An ideal student placement in Northern Ireland is currently at risk due to the UK visa requirements for their EU student and the sponsorship requirements for the business. And as far as I know, that opportunity was actually lost. They had to find a placement for that student in the Republic. So that's such a pity. Now, some of the workers that engaged with the report, then they mentioned, and actually some of the workers engaged with us, but most of their experiences came through engagement with the advice sectors. They deal with the complicated cases, the situations that workers find themselves in, and they're unsure. They know it's complicated, but they're unsure why. So it's the advice sector that really drills down and nitpicks and has to have that specialised knowledge about what exactly is the complication for that cross-border worker. And the advice sector has mentioned us then that they're finding there's an increase in the number of queries from EU citizens regarding employment in Northern Ireland. You know, they're not getting it, that the visa in the south doesn't transfer over to the north. So thankfully, the advice sector are catching lots of these individuals and going, whoa, that's not an opportunity for you unless you can get a visa. So just as the next point, then there's widespread misunderstanding that the right to work in one jurisdiction doesn't transfer to the other. And as I've already mentioned, the Frontier Worker Permit Scheme is generating very few inquiries over for us. We were so sure that we would be inundated with inquiries on that one, so that took us by surprise. And the advice sector has mentioned that to me as well. So this is a worry, and we'd like to know more about. We'd love to get information that drills down into this region. How many people who have an address in the Republic of Ireland applied for a permit, and we could make some assumptions that most likely they're crossing the border here to go to work. So this is a worry for us, because it definitely would suggest that some workers are at risk of being undocumented and vulnerable to exploitation. So that is without a doubt a worry. Now, look, just before we're going to pause, not just yet, but in a moment or two, we're going to pause the recording. But just before we do that, I just wanted to just highlight that this is the first in a series of All Island Labour Market webinars. Now, we may be able to hold some of them hybrid, but we'll see how this develops over time. It'll be between now and the middle of June. We will also bring to you webinars on skills and qualifications, tax and pensions, social security, divergent rights of workers when we think about what's happening in the landscape out there post-Brexit. We're going to really go and look for insights through the worker survey and with other surveys. The ESRI did a brilliant cross-border worker survey maybe half a year before ours. So we're going to have a look and drill down into some of those experiences that the workers had. What is encouraging them to take a cross-border job? What's stopping them from taking a cross-border job? Would they do it again with full information? So what opportunities are being lost, and how can we encourage them into the All Island work force? And then experiences with cross-border employers. We're going to drill down, present some examples of case studies. All of this work and your engagement today, we're very grateful for you to be with us. We'll all come together in the Centre's annual conference on the 18th September, which is taking place in Dundalk, and it will spotlight all of this, our report, the work from other places too, and all of the work that's out there being carried out. And really, we're going to drill down on the challenges and the opportunities that we have here to kind of exploit and untap all of the potential that is here. So we're just about to go into the discussion period now, and for that, we're not going to record it. So thanks for sticking with us through this recorded bit, and we're just going to pause the recording now. Thanks so much.